Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hope you're able to find a spot around the campfire and get cozy. My name is Danny. I'm part of Space Saloon. The other two members of Space Saloon are Rebecca and John, who are also here with me. And we're joined around the fire today with the Plot Gallery, which consists of Alex Coetzee, Max Melvill, and Ashleigh. So Ashleigh Killa. So we're going to share some stories with you tonight, but I just wanted to start off by talking about one story which is very similar to this in terms of context. In 1816, Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, John Polidori, they all were in Lake Geneva during a very dark and volcanic summer in Italy and Switzerland. If you don't know who Mary Shelley or Lord Byron or John Polidori are, they're essentially the creators of what is now known as modern Gothic horror. And during that night in 1816, they all, without electricity, without much, electricity didn't really exist yet. They were all sitting around the campfire, and someone came up with the idea to tell stories to one another. From that moment, from those stories that were told around the campfire, Frankenstein, Dracula, and a handful of other Gothic horror stories were invented and kind of gave birth to this whole genre. And we took a lot of inspiration from this, and we wanted to bring you into our fire pit and talk to you about some stories about representation and knowledge. So yeah, thanks for joining.
Thanks, Danny. Maybe we could start at the very beginning with a story about the origin of representation. There's a Roman story, I think often called the Maid of Corinth, that talks about a Corinthian girl who traced the outline of her lover's shadow on a rock before he went into battle, before she was about to seduce him. And I think that story speaks quite beautifully about representation's ability to stand in for something, to stand in for so much while being something so little, just a simple outline could suffice to replace your lover. So I think it speaks quite beautifully about loss and about accuracy, about representation to replace something real.
Robin Evans in his essay Translations from Drawing to Building talks about these two paintings, or these stories represented through two paintings, one by Carl Schinkel and the other by David Allen. Now in Carl Schinkel's, it's the lover is outside, the tracing is using the sun, and it's on a rock. Now in the other version, David Allen's, the couple is inside, the projection is with a candlelight, and it's on the wall of a building. And I think that sets a really interesting kind of dichotomy between these two ideas of knowledge, representation, truth, or personal subjectivity, where one is using the sun, which as architects we would say is maybe more orthographic, and the other is using a candle, which is causing more of a distorted shadow in perspective. And that kind of, the differences between those remind me of things like Plato's cave, and the allegories of just how the shadows themselves can either be more true to the actual origin or kind of distorted in its translation from person to representation.
It's interesting how artists at that time, at the turn between 18th and 19th century, were concerned about truth and subjectivity. I'm thinking, of romantic painters. You were talking about painters, Danny. I'm thinking about, like how many tools and devices they invented in order to put that particular view into the canvas, thinking of the cloth glass or Black Mirror, thinking of the camera obscura. There is this nice description by Goethe at the beginning of the theory of color, where he imagines a thought experiment, a viewer placed inside the camera obscura, where there's only a little hole which lets the sunlight in. And he imagines to fix that bright dot of light, which normally we all perceive as orange or bright yellow. But then suddenly, whenever the shutter of the hole is closed and the viewer closes his own eyes, that dot expands and becomes blue. And this is something we everyone can kind of experiment and experience. And I think there's an interesting, as you mentioned, this dichotomy. It's interesting to think whether truth is in the objective reality outside of the camera obscura, or if color is within the realm of perception. So if it's in the eye of the beholder.
It makes me think a lot about the ideas of like accuracy as truth. I think common me of a great revisionist history podcast episode, which is Malcolm Gladwell's one of his podcasts, and I think the title of the episode called "Rap as a Word for a Liar." It retells the story of who was a famous mouth organist or harmonica player, sort of nearing the end of the war. And he ends up mysteriously getting invited to this raid of this German bunker. And he's there with Ingrid Bergman, this famous actress at the time. And this is an amazing, seemingly unbelievable story of how this world famous musician, a world famous actress, and a whole bunch of war vets are now raiding this German bunker. And the story gets told by many people throughout time, including Larry Adler himself. And then many years down the line, there becomes these discrepancies start to open up between Larry Adler's story and then another famous spy at the time who happened to be in that bunker as well. And their two stories and accounts of the evening have some similarities, but a lot of differences. And I guess the motto of the podcast episode is looking at like how we look at memory. And even though Larry Adler's memory or account of this night in this German bunker is very different from the spy's, it doesn't make it less true for him. And it makes me think about sort of accuracy and truth, and then also about shadows and ghosts. And maybe the shadow of this lover that is traced, that Alex shared in the beginning, is that maybe as real as, or can it be perceived as being as real as if the lover was there as well? And it makes me also question representation in the realm of architecture as well.
Yeah, when you talk about this idea of accuracy, I sort of have to bring it down to something that I find myself compulsively obsessing over when I specifically am working in drafting programs like Rhino or AutoCAD. I find it really entertaining, or I struggle with it in a way, in how I almost obsess over details that will never be visible to the human eye. So I'll overly zoom into an inaccuracy that's almost less than a millimeter and correct it, regardless of the fact that it actually is meaningless. And there's this feeling almost of losing myself in these XYZ planes.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point about orthography, is that it is also a point of view that you could only have in reality if you were infinitely far away from something or infinitely close to it, pressed up right against it. So I think it talks a bit about the how unachievable a kind of true sense of orthography really is. You can always keep on zooming and never really get to that ultimate resolution.
There's been a lot of examples in our architecture practice where we've started to question that as well, Alex. A lot of it specifically within our sort of design make program, where we're trying to strive towards an attitude towards making that is maybe stripped from the infinite accuracy and therefore inaccuracy of certain type of architectural representations, whether it be plan sections or things of orthographic view. And it's curious to see how that brings to fore this sort of like this idea of like looseness or like gestures that are embodied in like this learning through making, as opposed to relying on like maybe like a set of guidelines or rules. And yeah, there's been some funny examples of how that has sort of been such a positive thing in some ways, but then also almost rejected by other people or maybe like the industry itself.
It reminds me of a term used in geology quite a lot called limits of closure. And that term specifically refers to the gap between something that is real on the ground and then the representation through sort of geological means or geographic means of that place. And the gap essentially is this theoretical gap, which is talking about the fact that you can never quite achieve exactly where that spot is on the ground through representation. And I think it's, it's this slippery territory between those two places where these kind of ghosts of representation or ghosts of knowledge kind of come out or reside, let's say. And I think as architects, we're constantly exploring that space. And sometimes we find processes which take us farther away, or as Maak said, potentially take us a little bit closer because we've chosen to work a little bit more immediate with the site.
I mean, isn't the evolution of science all about trying to fill in that gap? I'm thinking, like going way back, what medieval philosopher called the horror vacui, the horror of the void. And, since you mentioned Plato before, since Plato, they started to theorize one material, which was called ether back then, which would, fill up emptiness and therefore, in a way, sustaining planets and giving a structure, explaining that gap, that in between, which was impossible to explain otherwise before the discovery of, not adjacent forces. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm thinking also in the realm of physics and astronomy, this idea of an emptiness which needs to be somehow filled went all the way up to Newton. In his light studies, Newton theorized this spectrum, which is nothing else than a ghost again in Latin, to explain the reason why light beams would diffract and compose white light. So I'm I have a feeling that, this discourse on emptiness and reality versus representation goes back to a fear of not knowing.
I'm going back to this idea of the ghost as well. What Danny was talking about, and Jan, you also, like this gap between the real place and its representation. I find it interesting that in site-specific theatre, there are theorists who use the same terminology of ghosts, referring to the imposed action. So the site, the place, the real location is defined as a host, and then the performative action is called a ghost, something that's temporary and in some ways out of place. And it makes me think of a performance by a theatre group called Blast Theory, who exploit that gap between city spaces and their virtual representations through the manifestation of a game. It's an interactive site-specific performance in which virtual users chase physical players through cities, and the virtual players navigate like this virtual replica of the city, so 3D extrusions and streets, while the performers on the ground are able to, exploit the things that the virtual players can't see. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's, they can hide in these little nooks and crannies and run through a mall, for example, but the virtual players are limited. And then the other thing that I find really interesting about the performance, which happened in cities all over the world, the runners, the people on the ground, could communicate with each other with walkie-talkies and collaborate to prevent capture, while the virtual players, the game players, were very isolated in their experience behind the screens.
I think so much, touching on that, Bex, so much I think of the role of the architect is this this connector. We're often in positions where we between maybe financiers and clients, and then between material and site, and then past, present, and future, and then contractors and clients, and it's this idea of sort of like connection comes up all the time, and it makes me wonder whether how much of the act of architecture is this act of memory or this act of archiving. And I think so much of what we're talking about in terms of representation is also that it's memory and archive. If one is tracing something or drawing something, it's either a tool to remember something or an aid to then create something new. And it's curious to then think about the realm of sort of what type of accuracy is needed, or what type of truth are you trying to represent. And I think that brings to fore many different approaches towards architecture and how one can go about the craft and use tools like representation to achieve certain material outcomes.
I think it's interesting, Max, when you talk about representation in relation to architecture, so to think about how buildings in some ways are drawings made real, how the kind of rules of representation, like composition, line weights, or tools that are kind of painterly and two-dimensional rules get translated into real built form. And that's always been something that has interested me, and kind of, I think the trap in seeing representation as the end goal in architecture is that you can always be seduced by whatever medium you're working with. And Rebecca was talking about infinitely zooming into whatever modeling software you're dealing with. I think one of the things that has interested me, the more I've become interested in representation, is acknowledging it as a real thing, and it's not as something virtual. It's something that still kind of relates to the body. And I think this idea of searching for kind of ultimate accuracy keeps representation as something virtual, as separate from the real world. And in some ways, that's a trap that architects can fall into.
What was the story
Alex
about
and,
Morales? Sorry, Danny. Yeah, I mean, sorry.
It was me. Can I chime in, Bex?
Chime in.
Quickly, chime in. No, Alex, building on what you were saying there, I mean, in a lot of conversations we've had in the past, you've talked a lot about like this an area of interest of yours, which is I've heard you define as materiality. I thought a lot about that and thought, I mean, is that the voice or the task of the architect? Often specific knowledge that is like trapped in sort of lexicon and convention, and maybe in some way representation, like read and draw a plan, and then the territory between that and then like a final built outcome. I mean, is that the architecture? And when we're talking about like this idea of accuracy or truth, I mean, our practice at the moment is kind of related to, I guess, community-based public infrastructure. And we always get conflicted or need to address this of like identity and ownership by these like sort of end users of the facilities that we're helping create. And we've often questioned how accurate we need to be in terms of like the detailing of like these buildings. And by being more loose and less accurate, does that allow room for people who are actually constructing these buildings to instill their own ownership through the process of making? And that's made us question a lot about how we go about representing or existing between this slippery territory between representation and the real.
I think that's maybe is a good bridge to talk about what you mentioned, Rebecca. You asked about murales.
Yeah, I wanted to know that. I mean, I remember one of you mentioning it, this lecture that Morales gave. Yeah, you need to elaborate. I don't know more about it.
Yeah, it was a lecture called Shadows and Alphabets that I think he gave actually at the AA years ago. And in the start of the lecture, he starts by tracing or drawing on a chalkboard a painting by Miro. And he explains that the thing that he always finds impressive about Miro's paintings is that in the final version, there seems to exist all of the thousands of iterations that led up to it. And the particular painting that he's tracing comes from a series of sketches that Miro did in a sketchbook in which each drawing left a kind of trace on the next page. And he did many iterations of these drawings. And so I think this idea of the shadow comes from that when you make a mark, it leaves a trace that doesn't get erased. And for murales, this is a kind of way for architecture to exist in time. And I think, talking about his own architecture, one does get the sense of kind of, it seems to have come about through time. It doesn't seem to have appeared all at once. And I think this is an interesting way of thinking about architecture as in relation to that dimension, which is often neglected. We think about aspects related to 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions, but often forget about the 4th. And what you're talking about, Max, in terms of the process, I think starts to deal with that as well.
I mean, maybe in an attempt to try and understand these themes in different light, because sometimes I struggle in that. I mean, Danny, I know your practice, you're very interested in this idea of limited closure, and Alex, you as well, this idea of the gap between representation and reality is something that has structured your arts practice in sort of a very clear way, but maybe like how I relate to it, like what is it for me? Maybe it's what is lost that we just shouldn't care about. And I suppose, yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just, I think there are two things we're saying here. One is what is gained through the case of the Mariah's Miro example. Every time you produce a new drawing or a new tracing, that is actually multiplying what is possible. Whereas I think some of us are arguing that within each translation or each step from one to the next, there's actually lots of things that are lost. And to me, those are the ghosts, those are the monsters, those are the things which disappear. For example, Bruno Latour, who is a social scientist who studies the way that other disciplines sort of work as almost an anthropologist looking at different cultures, has a famous essay where he studies or he follows a geologist, a botanist, and other scientists into the Amazon and observe the ways that they construct knowledge and the tools and the processes that they go about doing that with. And he makes some acute observations about the fact that they're standing in the field, yet they feel more connected to the field as their science, as their scientific kind of disciplines dictate. They feel more comfortable around a map or around a collection of rocks and plants than they do in the actual field. And I think there's an irony to that, and there's something actually interesting about that each step from collecting to transcribing to archiving to trying to write about and communicate, you are essentially removing yourself farther and farther from the site. But maybe to wrap it back to the Mariah's Miro example, you're also amplifying what that site means to you as a discipline. So now any geologist can feel part of that site because they can read your notes on the site. And I think there's really interesting dichotomy in those moments.
I've been reading this book, and in the lunchtime before this chat, I was just reading through a passage and building on what you're saying there, Danny, in terms of also like what is gained and what is lost, and then the example of Miro of like this kind of almost ripple effect and this iteration and layering. I came across this quote by Pablo Picasso. If you don't mind, I'll just quickly read it. It's short. So first he says, creativity is first of all an act of destruction. When you begin a picture, you often make some pretty discoveries. You must be on guard against these. Destroy the thing. Do it several times. In each destroying of a beautiful discovery, the artist does not really suppress it, but rather transforms it, condenses it, makes it more substantial. What comes out in the end is the result of the discarded finds. Otherwise, you become your own connoisseur. I sell myself nothing. And I think it's quite interesting to think about that. And like, we're always in this process of like layering of whether it's ideas or marks or lines or materials, and to think about that as a process and to be aware of what can be lost or gained in either the addition or subtraction of in that process.
I think I'm just interested in not caring about what's lost. I'm very interested in this idea of improvisation as a way of breaking out of these restrictions and almost unlearning what I learned in architecture school. Performance allows me the freedom to embrace mistakes, and I'm very interested in sort of seeing chance as a way of generating and creating art.
I love this. I love that we started to talk about chance, and I mean, in a way, what you were describing through the quote, Max, this idea of creating chaos as a necessary precondition for invention and performance, is a sort of way to put your body out there and be exposed to mistakes. It reminds me of a story of science, actually, not art. But do you know how, what is the sort of the clearest and most trusted proof of the Big Bang? Is actually this discovery, which was also made by chance by this radio astronomers who were actually scanning between astral objects. So the space in between, they were trying to understand if they could get a clean image, because wherever they pointed their radio telescope, they would always get TV static, basically, so in interference. And they, they couldn't explain that. They tried to think about nearby radios, TVs. They even thought about pigeons pooping in the cone of their telescope. But eventually, through a series of measurements, they figure out the dimension of that static was exactly equal to what Einstein's theory of relativity would assume the residual energy of the Big Bang to be today. So, in a few words, basically, by looking into nowhere, they found out the image of the Big Bang, which is slowly dimming out and is now just in infrared radiation when it used to be, the brightest thing. So I love this idea that you discover things when you look in between what you already know.
That reminds me of another story. This one by Lewis Carroll. Sylvie and Bruno Concluded is the title. And I'm going to read a little excerpt from it. And it kind of parallels this idea of what is real versus the representation and what is lost or gained. That's another thing we've learned from your nation, said Mein Herr, map making. But we've carried it much further than you. What do you consider the largest map that would be really useful? About 6 inches to the mile, I said. Only 6 inches, exclaimed Mein Herr. We very soon got to 6 yards to the mile. Then we tried 100 yards to the mile, and then came to the grandest idea of all. We actually made a map of the country on the scale of the mile to the mile. Have you used it much? I inquired. It has never been spread out yet, said Mein Herr. The farmers objected. They said it would cover the whole country and shut out the sunlight. So we now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you, it does nearly as well.
We're very interested in opening the floor up to the audience and inviting everybody to sort of join the fire pit, and sort of share maybe any thoughts that you've been thinking about as we've discussed what's come to mind. Maybe just to take the pressure off, and I've been wanting to do this the whole time, I'm going to read a poem by William Carlos William, just in a way of questioning how these same concerns relate to a number of different fields. Poetry for me is also a form of representation. It's one of my absolute favorite poems. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were so delicious, so sweet, and so cold. Please feel free to switch your mics on. I think that should be possible now. Turn your videos on as well if you want, or use the chat function. But it would be great to hear some stories or some thoughts from anybody who's been observing and listening to the conversation thus far.
Hello guys, I'm joining the fire pit. Thanks so much so far. It's been really a beautiful performance. A question from me. You guys have spoken a lot about the gap and the kind of the limits of closure, and I'm wondering if there are any examples where it has been possible to kind of close that gap at all. Is it possible to close that gap? Is improvisation and chance one of those ways? Or is it something that we just have to forever strive for because we haven't achieved it yet?
I'm just thinking, I mean, one of the ways to kind of close the gap is to pretend it doesn't exist. So in other words, I mean, you could pretend that the gap between representation and the real isn't there, or that, whenever you produce, something representational, it is also real. And I think vice versa, something real always has the ability to maybe enter into the realm of representation. We were talking, just because Rebecca mentioned William Carlos Williams, we were talking yesterday about imagism, which is the movement of poetry that he's loosely associated with. And there's this idea of kind of bringing an immediacy to like what is very mediated form, poetry, in imagism, that it kind of had this directness that you would experience when you experience something perhaps like painting. And I think that's in a way, for me, a way of kind of bringing the representation and the real closer together. It's to kind of acknowledge the poem as a real thing that you confront on the page. And so sometimes William Carlos Williams would have no titles to his poems, so that you would just confront it as a thing. And he often spoke about trying to kind of achieve an objectivity, and perhaps not in the sense of truth, but in the sense of it being an object. And his most famous, well, for me, a kind of mantra that comes out of a poem of his, a sort of song that goes, "No ideas but in things." And I think that idea of, well, bringing ideas into the realm of the real is in a kind of a way of acknowledging that all things representational have some kind of real form.
I've got a question, maybe this is important for the students in the room. Like, why does this matter? We all teach at architecture schools. Why are we talking about this subject in the first place? We've also got Jean or Jan. Please feel free to turn your mic off and.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for your stunning fireside conversation. And I just want to sort of take up the last question in relation to everything that's been said. And I was going to say that, well, the point that you made, Rebecca, about why does this matter, the gap. And I think that to close that gap has consequences. And speaking from a kind of contemporary psychoanalytic clinical perspective, that closure, that refusal to recognize the gap is a foreclosure. And the consequences of that is that what's contained in the gap, which is the limits of representation, or the limits of the symbolic and the imaginary, starts to pile up like mounds of waste, which produce a conflagration. I'm quoting Jacques Lacan here. So the kind of consequences of closure is to not accept that the real is the state of the impossible, and that the law of absolutely everything, including jurisprudence, isn't grounded. It's not, there isn't an other of the other. So there's actually a gap in the other. And to actually foreclose on that gap and not recognize it, which certain trajectories in science have done in the past has subjective effects. And psychosis is one of those effects.
Yeah, lots to think about there.
So I suppose I'm just really on the side of trying to live with that terror of uncertainty that came up from Max, I think, at some point, the fact that we have to find a way to live with uncertainty and accept their limits on knowledge. And I think you're right. I think that the work of art is a way of incarnating a presence that contains what is foreclosed if one doesn't accept the gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think something we were kind of questioning, we all are architects, we all studied architecture, actually many of us together, but we all felt that these conversations weren't happening while we were students, and that we were being asked to make really beautiful drawings. And often the drawing seemed to be more important than the idea itself. As long as you could represent it, as long as you could have something on paper that had an aesthetic value, you could succeed. But that relationship between the drawing and the idea, or the drawing and the building, or the drawing and it wasn't really ever discussed.
Can I
think there's
on that? I mean, firstly, I'd just like to say what I love about what I'm looking at on the screen, between the 4 screens and what's going on in each screen. The important thing for me are the interstitial spaces between the layers, and also the oscillation between the different screens, because there are 4 screens, but within each screen there's screens, and it's the interstitial spaces that contain the real for me in what I'm actually looking at. And the kind of incommensurable areas in this kind of discursive spaces that you're trying to construct together. It's those gaps that seem very important to me. But just to take up the point that you've just made, I mean, if one goes to Hegel, for instance, Hegel says the dialectic swallows the world and digests it, and that's the dialectic. And then you get a tradition of thought, and Lacanian psychoanalysis is one of these, that says that some things can't be swallowed by the dialectic. They can't be sublated. They stick in the throat and can't be swallowed. And that's where sublimation in the work of art comes into play, because it goes to that area of excess that simply can't be swallowed along with the rest of the world and sublated in the big Hegelian idealist dialectic. It remains undigestible. And I think for me, this is what you're trying to circulate around.
And I think that's the challenge of architecture, is to decide what is digestible or not, and to somehow differentiate between an attitude towards that in the act of making. And I mean, I completely agree with you with regards to these in-between spaces being the things that are the most live or the most real. And it makes me think about what Bex was also talking about with regards to performance and spontaneity and improvisation. And ultimately, as architects, we are creating things that are to house improvisation, which is life. And like that is something that is completely unpredictable. And if improvisation can't be digested or consumed in the spaces that we create, then maybe we're making a similar mistake to creating a map of one-to-one of the world, where it's become so prescribed that it becomes useless. But yeah, I think a lot of what you talked about there, Jean or John, so I don't know how to say your name. Yeah, I think it's really good.
My last comment, I promise, is that I think what's very interesting in what you're saying is that I think a closed topology, a topology which is just closed, isn't what we're looking at, what you're interested in. But I think life is too open. So I think what is important is an open-closed topology, something that both is closed but also porous and open to the outside, and that folds the outside in and the inside out. So it's an open-closed topological space rather than a closed one or a totally open one, which is life. I think architecture and art and galleries or whatever have to provide, an art as a space, for instance, architecture as a space, can't be totally open because that's life, as you were saying, and it can't be totally closed because then you've got, a gatekeeping glorification of what's already reified in neoliberal, capital, for instance. I think what you're talking about is something that is emancipatory because it opens to the outside and brings the outside in. So it's an open, closed, processual topology.
That made me think of so many things, but I want to open it up to the floor again. Maybe those comments also sparked some reactions from anyone else in the room. Students, don't be afraid. You're allowed to say things that maybe don't make sense. It would be great to hear some comments, or also, again, you can make a question or comment on the chat.
I think I might just want to, I don't know if this is a comment or a question. It's kind of formulating as I say or ask. But in our summer course unit, we had a presentation from Cream Projects, and they were talking about from let's say a virtual world point of view, the layers of detail that goes into creating virtual worlds, but then also saying that virtual worlds and the physical world isn't something that should be viewed as two separate things, that they are in a way similar, or they both serve one another in a sense. Because if I think of it like from an artist or a filmmakers or anyone who has an eye for something that they want to create, like it's almost like a virtual world that they bring into being, into the physical, even if it only just stops at the digital point, maybe. But it is an experience that they create for whomever is either observing it through the screen or experiencing it through VR, or then coming into the physical or final product, maybe. So to a degree, I kind of agree with that view. And then also having heard what you spoke about the gap, or being so focused on finer details that maybe aren't seen by other people who would never spoke about how they'd have to import even just a small b into this virtual world that they've created. And maybe we wouldn't notice it immediately when looking at it, because there are all these other layers of reality that they've emulated that catches our eye first. And then we don't necessarily notice that small detail. But I think it is fascinating to hear about that gap, because even if, let's say, you don't have the VR equipment and you're not able to experience it the way it was intended or something, there is that loss of the experience, I guess, because you can't experience it the way it was created to be. So I think that's probably more of a comment than a question, but I find it quite fascinating that it's not just a few of us who have that experience of having to zoom all the way in and then realize like nobody's going to see this. So it's not it's a question of like, what do you put your attention to and stuff like that.
I think it's interesting you're taking the conversation into artificial augmented reality, virtual reality. Because, you know, we often explore also these tools, and we always kind of conflicted between the potential of augmenting some of the information, as Danny was talking before about scientific methods, and what is left behind, which doesn't fall within the lens. Maybe it's about, you know, like bringing awareness about what is the focus of each lens, because not always that is declared clearly. I don't know if this resonates.
I think what you're saying, John, is also, what is the focus of each lens, but also kind of what is the medium through which you're experiencing it. I mean, this is just kind of my personal interest in the kind of virtual realm through being involved in the plot, which, for those of you who don't know, myself and Max and Ashleigh are part of a collective called The Plot, which is a virtual gallery. And we've been kind of very interested in what, I guess, the politics around aesthetics or the aesthetic experience of virtual reality, like which tends to kind of distance it from the real. You tend to be sucked into that world. And one thing we've been really interested in is like acknowledging the kind of the thing that you're experiencing it through. So whether it be the screen or kind of the lens that that brings you that virtual experience, that there is material there, and that is a kind of a real experience. And we've been trying to kind of play with that in a way with all of the work that we've been doing with virtual reality. And how can we give it a sense of touch or a sense of texture, or things that we would kind of typically associate with real experiences, and kind of play with those boundaries that seem to exist between the two, and in a way try to break them.
Yeah, Alex, I was also thinking about the plot when Tsecho was speaking. And I think a lot of what you just mentioned, and I think what we've been in pursuit of, is like this authenticity of like an experience. And we've been doing that through certain sort of formats. And I think it like nicely fits somewhere between like this territory of representation and the real, where we're not actually trying, or we've been critical of like things like VR or AR or digital means of like trying to replace what can only exist in reality. Instead of looking at, we've often talked about like what is the materiality of the online, and like I think questions like that bring to the fore like a host of new sort of like possibilities that like when they exist aren't trying to bridge this gap that we are saying that we like so much between representation and the real, but it's like creating almost like new space and new territory for exciting things to exist now and beyond. But yeah.
Our time is up. Was there another comment?
Love another comment.
We were always happy to have more comments. I'm not sure if I just interrupted somebody or not.
No, I was just saying thanks.
Oh, okay, great. We just want to thank everybody for attending, and I hope you enjoyed the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've got one more comment.
Yes.
I just have to say it. I mean, Beckett, who's very interested in that limit experience, how to go to that limit, says that, and it's in Alan Badgew's fantastic book on aesthetics, is that it's an exercise in worsening, because the subject needs certainty. So to actually, an identity needs certainty, but a subject is dealing with that gap. And to go to that limit experience and have an authentic encounter involves you doing some work with this, your identity. You almost disidentify with the certainties. And that movement toward that limit is a series of exercises of worsening, making things worse and worse and worse and worse, and failing and failing and failing.
That's fascinating. Is that from Beckett?
It's Beckett. Beckett, I'm quoting Beckett.
Yeah.
But if you want to, yes, you can actually find this in Alan Badgew's book on inesthetics. It's been translated by Alberto Toscano, and there's a fantastic section on exactly this.
Do you know the theatre director Mila Rao?
Yes.
Working currently. I find his work fascinating for the same reason.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you. It's been great. Your comments been great. Thanks, everyone.